All right, everyone. Want to welcome you and thank you for being here. My name is Daniel Tucker, and I'm the director of the Museum Studies program here at the University of the Arts. And this is the first in a new series that we are developing that's intended to share the work and research of our faculty. And so keep an eye out for more in the future. I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker, and I'll tell you a little bit about the structure of our night. So our speaker tonight is Monica Montgomery, who is a thought leader, consultant, and professor operating at the nexus of culture, equity, and education. She serves as a scholar and advisor for leaders and a creative across a range of creative institutions, including museums, associations, historical and humanities councils, nonprofits, universities, and many other forms of organization. She works on community engagement and DEI initiatives, and she champions what she calls ecologies of promise. Known for her curating of social justice exhibits, including Museum of Impact and founding diversity initiatives like Museum Hue. Over the last 2 decades, Monica has served as an executive director, fundraiser, marketer, project manager, and educator. Her career credits include a TEDx talk, a Southwest by Southwest plenary, and over 40 curated contemporary art and public history exhibits with renowned organizations that are too many to list right here, but we'll hear some about her work in this presentation. In addition to her wealth of experience, we're happy to say that Monica teaches in the Museum Studies program here at UArts. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Monica Montgomery to share her talk about socially responsive museums.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you to all of you who took time to join us tonight, whether you are a prospective student or an alumni, or just someone who is passionate about the work of museums and society. We welcome you. And it's really great to be with you. Hopefully, we have a great dialogue after the presentation. So I'm going to jump into the slides, and I'm speaking about broadly what I call socially responsive museum practice. Okay, so socially responsive museums, right? What is that? What does that mean? And I have a working definition in one of the slides, but basically, museums that are using their privilege, their positioning, and their awareness to reach the public. Okay. Um, and doing so in a way that is responsive to current events and issues and change, right? Social justice, what is happening in the world today. This is an image of an artist that I've curated and worked with, and he is a sculptor. And in this sculpture, he is depicting what he calls the forgotten voices and the forgotten faces in Brooklyn, New York. And so you might just at first see kind of a metal slab and he's standing next to it explaining it, because a lot of times when I curate exhibitions, I like to have artists tell the story of their own work. As a curator, certainly I have my take and my interpretation, but I think it's also important for the artist to have that first voice and to speak. And so he is telling the story. And what he was saying to the crowd assembled is that the silhouette images, the cutouts in the metal, are images of a young woman and a young man, African American, who grew up, born and raised in Brooklyn, but who oftentimes you wouldn't see in the neighborhood anymore due to gentrification, due to being priced out, due to epidemics of gun violence and intra-community violence. They're kind of a disappearing population, but yet he wanted to represent them in sculptural form. And so he made this as a series of sculptures and put them in parks all around the city of New York. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. Hold on one second. I am new to this computer. Let's see if I can find the slides. Bear with us, bear with us. And I might need, I wanted to touch the wrong thing. Daniel, can you assist me. I think I touched something and everything disappeared. Okay, so I'm pressing this. Okay, thank you. Such a generous group we have here at UArts. You'll see once you attend and enroll. So, in this moment, museums are responding to years, right, of a lot of discontent from audiences, years of the reckoning, whether that is reckoning around racial equity, reckoning around wars and natural disasters, the public health and pandemics, and the crises in the world. And these are just images, just two that I've selected from some of these years. This is a mural of George Floyd, who was slain by police up in Minneapolis, and who, justice is still being sought, but certainly his face and his words before he was killed have been a clarion call. And the term Black Lives Matter is often used to represent those like him who were prematurely slain in the prime of their life by very unfair circumstances. And so the mural says, Black Lives Matter, fight racism. And it shows his face in the face of officers that are turning away from him. This other image is from a protest, but I thought it was particularly poignant because it is an image of children. And one of the children is holding a Black Lives Matter sign. The other is holding a sign that says, I can't breathe, which were some of the last words of George Floyd, Eric Garner, and many other people who were subject to this kind of violence. And so, with these things happening in the world, even at this moment, when there might seem like there's relative calm because it's the holidays, these things are still on people's minds. They've still affected and traumatized our collective psyche, our individual spirits. And museums have to grapple with that. Museums need to be more trauma informed, more aware of what is happening in the world, and ready to respond and hold space for an audience that is changing. I wanted to show a poll, and again, this is pre-pandemic, but relevant nonetheless, from a group called Museum Next. They do a lot of work around professional development for museum workers, hosting conferences and webinars, as well as doing some survey research and asking audience about their expectations and thoughts. So they did a poll kind of about socially responsive practice. This was done in 2017. And one of the questions they asked back then, this was kind of before this modern moment that we are seeing of an uprising, of a revolution, of a reckoning. They asked people, do you think that you would be more likely to visit a museum that took a stand on issues that matter to you? And 50% of the people said yes. 50% of the people would be more likely to visit and would assumably want that kind of content. And then in the next question, and there were many in this poll, by the way, but I pulled out these two. They asked, do you think that a museum that talks about social issues would be more or less relevant to you? And about maybe 44% of the people said more relevant. There were about 22% that said less relevant. And many people were on the fence and not sure. But I would wager and guess that if this poll were retaken today and this data collected, that even more people might be voting and logging in answers saying that they would want to visit a museum that took a stand on issues and that the social issues would be relevant to them. Because at this point, everyone has been affected somehow by what is happening in the world, what is happening in our neighborhoods, what is happening in our government, in our schools, in our hospitals, in our faith-based institutions. Somewhere, somehow, people have been affected. And oftentimes, when institutions like museums look to interpret and analyze and amplify the work that is happening or the issues that are happening, that can very much engender and pique the interest of audiences and people like ourselves. So this definition, right? This is my definition of a socially responsive museum. A museum that has an architecture of practice to honor our humanity, centering advocacy and empathy and social responsibility. A museum that has community care that embraces our visitors, our communities, and ourselves. And I think ultimately envisioning socially responsive museum practice is how an organization can be that much more public facing and responsive to what is happening in the world, whether that's an artist residency or having an activist in residence, whether museums are expanding to welcome activists, conveners, organizers, or collaborators, or just to have more representation and intersectionality in what they are presenting and who is doing the presenting. Oftentimes, museums are wanting to welcome more people in, right? So, what does that look like? Sometimes it's making sure that they go outside of the walls and invite folks who have normally not come or not been interested or not felt welcome. And sometimes that's doing the work inside of the museum to make sure that art, science, ideas, history, and those lived experiences that people are having can flourish. So, there's a variety of strategies around being socially responsive, but it's going that extra step to make sure that we are community centered and visitor centered. And again, that advocacy, empathy, and social responsibility is at the fore. Socially responsive museums can do so many things and have so much potential. And I would say in this moment, many museums, whether they would identify this way or not, are starting to turn in this direction. This is becoming more mainstream than not, certainly since the pandemic years, certainly since some of the things that have happened in society. More museums, from what I have seen as a consultant, as a patron, as well as the reading and the research that I've done, are starting to try, right, to go beyond business as usual, status quo, collections over community, and do this work. And so oftentimes it's museums that are building new audiences and partnerships and thinking deeply about what does it mean to partner, not in a spirit of transaction, right, but in reciprocity and interaction. Museums that are deepening their connections with existing communities and trying to foster goodwill and trust. And to that point, when there is goodwill and trust that is broken, museums that are willing to do the repair, to find out what happened, what went wrong, and how to remedy and make it right. Museums that are surfacing consensus in all things and finding the common threads, doing things like having community and exhibit advisory boards and making decisions in groups about things that are central to the communities that they serve, as opposed to being hierarchical and top down. Museums that showcase the urgency of current events, that are holding space for the dialogues and the tensions that spring forth there. That might be a museum that is discussing something happening in society. They might have scholars attending, but they might have other folks who might normally not have had a platform, but who have a very strong opinion or lived experience that also needs to be part of that dialogue. Often it is said in the work of community engagement, think about who's at the table, how to make more space at the table, and who doesn't even know the table exists, and get all those perspectives in a room. Museums that are having these timely think tanks and talks, living and breathing institutions that are evolving as time goes on, and museums that ultimately are fostering meaning making and memories for future generations. There are some touch points that I've kind of made a bucket list of for infusing socially responsive practice in museums. There's outreach, exhibits, visitor experience, programs, and education. And we'll define each of those and give a few examples. I do have a video to play for you, and I really would like to start with this because I think it perfectly illustrates the work, right, of a socially responsive museum. This is focusing on the Speed Art Museum in Kentucky, and they did an exhibit called Promise, Witness, Remembrance in conjunction with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Smithsonian. This museum did an exhibit to honor the life and the legacy of Breonna Taylor, who was another Black woman ruthlessly slain at the hands of police during those years where many Black Lives Matter protests were happening and where many people were being slain. And this image of her was created by Amy Sherald, but there was much more that was displayed to honor her life and work. And they very much centered her community, her mother, her family, and worked with them on the making of this exhibition. Let's watch. And let me know if you're having trouble hearing.
As a city struggling to respond, to grieve, to react, to move forward following the killing of Breonna Taylor, other deaths that followed, a year of protests, an enormous spike in gun violence across the city and the country. This exhibit from the beginning has represented our attempt, like what would it look like for a museum to try to serve a city going through what Louisville's been going through, to try to serve our country at a time of need.
When you walk into the museum, into the galleries, on your sightline, you see the portrait of Breonna Taylor painted by Amy Sherald. It's the only thing you see. If you've come to the museum to just see that painting, you know exactly where to find it. If you want to engage with the exhibition as a concept, you can also do that. So the intention with this placement was to make the portrait accessible, to make people feel comfortable, to know where they were intending to go, to also understand the importance of this exhibition in relationship to the story of Breonna Taylor. The title Promise, Witness, Remembrance was developed from a conversation I had with Tamika Palmer when I asked her what this exhibition could do for her and represent for her daughter's legacy. It was also important to understand that this exhibition was meant to connect the local to the national. So when I first started on this journey, I knew where the painting was going to end up. I knew that it was going to be co-acquired by the Smithsonian and by the Speed Museum. And so I looked pointedly to how I could start that conversation between the local and national throughout the exhibition, thinking about promise, you know, so the sections, the artworks, artists.
Oh, say, can you see by freedom's clear light?
The first section is promise, which is the promise of a nation and the symbols that the promise is meant to afford its citizens. Key things like national anthems, flags, voting rights, and the military that uphold them are what artists and artworks in this section look at. Hank Willis Thomas has the two works, the flags that are flanking the doors, and each star represents a person killed by gun violence in the United States in the year that they represent.
That your liberty's dying.
The next section, Witness, thinks not only about the curatorial framework, but also about visitors to the museum. I anticipate many will be first-time visitors. So this portion of the exhibition really unpacks what artists do. Artists help us understand the contemporary moment. And in this section, I've paired historical works with more contemporary ones to tell a larger story about witnessing and sometimes protesting. The muffled drums is one of the first protests or marches for Black lives in the United States. And it was organized by the NAACP. And then the protest photographs of Louisville, focusing on historic, contemporary, you know, timely but enduring. Remembrance is a section that looks at artworks that have been created to honor those lost to gun violence and or police brutality and their legacies. The exhibition was developed in conversation with many key constituents. I initially developed a national panel of advisors to guide the conversation from the onset. These people come from very different walks of life. They've all experienced gun violence and or police brutality, either in their families or communities, or stand in solidarity. I spent a lot of time listening to the Louisville Steering Committee and also the team at the Speed Museum. And from these conversations, alongside listening to Tamika Palmer, is how the curatorial framework developed.
I'm hoping that this type of work, this type of co-creation, where we've worked with community has had a voice, not just a superficial voice, but a really in-depth autonomy as of the outcome that happens. I'm hoping that that becomes a new model, that institutions learn from us, that this can happen. You can work with community and make programming and exhibitions together.
So at the Speed, our mission is to invite everyone to celebrate art forever. So consistent with that, and also because of the nature of this exhibit, everything about it is free. Admission, parking, we want this to be extremely accessible for a lot of reasons. One, no one should be making money off of this experience, and we aren't. But even more so, we want everyone to come through this exhibit together.
Every visitor is going to be different. I'm going to have a different experience because I'm a Black woman. I'm at the heart of things that are happening here, so I experience it as first person. But if you have not been at the heart of what has happened here, taking that in and really understanding someone else's truth, right, through their voice, through their eyes is important, but also really reflecting on your place in that, right? Have you been supportive of this movement? Has it been a little intimidating or frightening at some points? And really examining kind of how we can move forward together.
So that was a really great example of a video, right? Documentation of socially responsive museum practice at the Speed Art Museum, which to my knowledge, prior to this, had not done an exhibition, a series, a program like this before, engaging families, right, of persons who have been deceased, who have been violently killed, engaging in movement work that was happening in tandem with the time this exhibit was on display, engaging the mother of Breonna Taylor, as well as the communities that cared and supported her, and looking at her life not as a story of sorrow, but certainly looking at it as a spirit of triumph in the celebration of who she was, what she accomplished, and how we need to say her name and remember her. And so when you see a large encyclopedic museum, be it art or history or a science center, do this kind of work, and we're seeing this more and more, it shows that there's a shift in museum practice. And that is, again, what we're talking about today, this socially responsive practice, museums attempting to address current events, which enables this nimble, community-driven approach to all of the work of a museum. Starting with outreach, just to keep the pace here, how can museums connect to community partners and find ways to engage? How can museums advocate for just societies and be a space for exchange, for sharing progress and platform in community? Certainly, when I say platform, that might look like a museum sharing the platform they have, or co-authorship or shared authority with other groups and institutions that may not be part of the existing structure. So if a museum has a social media takeover and lets one of their partners or artists or community groups be leveraging the social media handle and putting in the content for that day and kind of making a narrative shift from what they normally might be sharing on TikTok or X or Facebook or YouTube, but then they're developing and being open to new content that's taking the conversation in a new direction. That's an example of sharing a platform. Also, there are museums that straight up will be philanthropists, right? And give a good deal of their resources, their grants, or let folks use their space so that their platform can be shared. Sharing progress is an example of what we see here. The Museum of Us, which is in San Diego, part of the Balboa Park Consortium, where there are several museums in a park-like setting, does really interesting work. They used to be called the Museum of Man and have a problematic history, both in the title and in some of the things that they had acquired through unethical means. But they are in the process of repatriation. They are in the process of deeply engaging with the Native American community that is adjacent to where they are, whose human remains and sacred artifacts they have, called the Kume'e. And they have started annually doing, in addition to this land acknowledgement, this is taken as a section from something they've been doing called an impact report, where they are sharing out every year on what they started to do, what they aimed to do, what they said they would do, and then what got accomplished at the end of the year. That looks like their sustainability and green building efforts. They are in the process of renovating their campus, but also what they're doing as it relates to repatriation and repair and many of the other projects and initiatives that most museums will make an announcement about, but then you won't hear afterwards, how did it go? So they've been doing some really interesting work, and I just took a snapshot from their most recent impact report of their land acknowledgement, but their resource of their impact accountability report is on their website. Highly encourage you to check it out in your spare time. Another museum local to Philadelphia that's doing great work is the Penn Museum. And on their site, they have a whole web page with a lot of clickable links and downloadable information about their social responsibility efforts. Penn Museum is another archaeology and anthropology museum connected to the University of Pennsylvania, but they have also been doing the work to try to repair relationships and apologize for harms, as well as repatriate items. They have had some things you might have seen in the news related to the Move bombing, which was a local incident that happened here in Philadelphia with African American activists. Also, they have some remains and human remains from other time periods, but they are in the process of trying to rectify all of that and being very transparent of how they do so. They've even gone a step further in building an advisory committee, which I'm happy to sit on, that is giving regular advisement and counsel on what directions the museum should take, and they're very open to the advisement. They're also doing a lot around DEI, creating certain hiring cultures and representation within that, ethical collection and teaching practices, and all sorts of things that you would want to see a museum doing. So again, all the examples I'm giving are publicly searchable, and you're welcome to check out their social responsibility page. Also want to highlight the Smithsonian. As you know, the Smithsonian is, America's largest museum on America's backyard, including over 19 different units and research spaces and places all over the country that have all sorts of content in them. And the Smithsonian also has been reckoning with what to do to return human remains, sacred objects that were taken through empire or plunder or unethical dealers. And they are right now implementing this policy. They have an ethical returns policy where they have outlined, based on their strategic priorities, what they will do, how they will do it, and who is advising that process. And just to read a little bit of this, and then from the next page is more of their ethical return policies. They have these bullet points, right? We believe that past acquisitions raising ethical concerns should be investigated and addressed in a manner consistent with current ethical standards. And then they go deeper into that tenet of how they will do that, why they will do that. So it's very heartening to see museums, large, small, in the East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, and all around the world, really, that are taking a stand on how they conduct their outreach, on how they do things to set a standard of accountability for themselves, and how they're working with communities. Thinking about exhibits, what is it like to have a socially responsive practice of exhibits? Exhibits, a curated or interpretive experience, excuse me for the typo, that story tells, that showcases collections, that make challenge colonial narratives, illuminate hidden histories, clarify, augment relevant social contexts and current events. And there's a whole lot of exhibits that are overtly a social justice exhibit, where like an image like this, where it's action and reaction, looking at the art and social justice of certain topics, but also exhibits that might not seem like a social justice exhibit, but still achieve and accomplish that. This is an image from an exhibition that was up in DC at President Lincoln's Cottage, which was the summer home of President Lincoln. And this was all about grief and child loss, picking up on the theme about President Lincoln's wife. I believe Mary Todd Lincoln is her name, and how she lost a child, and it deeply devastated her to the point where she had so much sorrow and depression, they were thinking of committing her to a mental institution. And they managed, to help her, grieve and heal with a lot of support. But at that time in, the world's history, there wasn't as much of a empathy for mental health as there is now. And so they wanted to explore this theme and think about how is it impacting audiences today. We're still in a place where infant mortality in some spaces is high, and where people lose children, lose partners, lose family members. So they had this really beautiful artistic tree made of paper in the center of the room. And each of the hanging leaves you see, they give an opportunity for someone to write the name of a loved one lost to live in this tree of remembrance. So this exhibit has a lot of tactility, something that is somber, certainly is reflected in the color choices and the lighting, but also you get a chance to leave your mark, right? To make your story part of the master narrative of the exhibit and potentially learn more about others that are grappling with this issue, right? Thinking about mental health and grief and life cycles. Another example of a great space that has many exhibits that is doing this work, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. They are helmed and led by Brian Stevenson, who is a civil rights lawyer and who has created this space that really looks at legacies of enslavement, but particularly the heinous and vicious practice of lynching. And what you're seeing here is a snapshot of some of their exterior, where on the ceiling there are these metal hanging bars, which are supposed to mimic or imitate a body, a human body. And each of those bars represents however many people that were lynched at a certain time in a certain place. They also have another section of this museum with soil samples from each of the places that they have documented a lynching. And these sorts of things are never easy to talk about, are very heavy, but necessary for the full and holistic telling of the history of America. And so this is a space that is in the Deep South that is doing the work to challenge what has happened in the Deep South and around the country. And many people are moved, often to tears, when they see the exhibits here in this space. This is another space that is relatively new. It's called the Greenwood Rising Museum. This is a digital image because I sourced this from the exhibit design firm that was planning their exhibits before they even opened, but they are now open. I think they've been open maybe a year now or a few months. And ultimately, they are in Tulsa, Oklahoma, telling the stories of the Tulsa race riots and what happened in the neighborhood, which was called Greenwood, it was a thriving Black business community. And one day there was contention, right, between the races. And certainly there were people that firebombed and committed heinous acts and violence against many of the Black citizens in this region and burned the businesses and many of the homes to the ground. So in this museum, they kind of give you two journey paths. You can take the path of learning about the neighborhood and the Black businesses and the ways that that was built up, and that is the less violent, visceral path. So that is where you're going through and seeing the content that doesn't include the violence, or you can take the path that shows the race riots and the fires and the burnings, but it gives people a chance to choose and a trigger warning, if you will, so that you're not automatically traumatized or the trauma isn't inflicted on you without you having consent. Another really good practice of socially responsive museums. Just to go a little quicker, because I know our time is elapsing, this is an image from an outdoor exhibit called Food for the People at the Anacostia Museum, which is part of the Smithsonian in DC. Anacostia is telling the story of DC and often the Black communities in DC, but often talking a lot about climate and the ways that foodways and sustainability has been championed by local activists and local groups, and that work continues today. And so they have images here of people who are farmers and food justice workers, as well as talking about where our food comes from, how people can get fresh, healthy produce and what that takes. And as along with this outdoor exhibit, this was happening during the pandemic. So they put the exhibit outdoors. They had a farmer's market that operated frequently along with culinary classes. Super, powerful way to illustrate the themes of the exhibit and make it come to life. To keep moving, the next tenet in our journey of socially responsive practice in museums is visitor experience, right? What is a visitor experience? It's kind of everything up into including your trip to the museum. So that's the welcoming and the belonging you may feel, the wayfinding and the signage that exists or doesn't exist, the well-being, the care, the respite, the places for contemplation that can be a part of your visit or that you might carve out on your own, and any sort of intervention that enhances everything beyond and around the exhibit, the journey map of the museum trip. So from the time you leave your home to the time you come to the museum, while you're there, as you're going home, the digital experience, all of that links to the visitor experience. And this is a snapshot of a article on the AAM website about why well-being is at the heart of museum experiences. So this image, right, another snapshot from an article that I pulled, You Belong Here. That is how museums often want to make visitors feel, that they belong, that they're anchored, that they can learn, they can exchange, they can be themselves. We know oftentimes that doesn't happen, but that is the aim and the goal of all museums, and to create a visitor experience that honors that. This was more from that article about museums and well-being and the different levels of well-being, personal well-being, intellectual well-being, social well-being, and physical well-being. And if we think of these realms, right, personal, intellectual, social, and physical, how can a museum advance people's feelings in the space around these areas? That is the high dream that many spaces are trying to do. They used to just call visitor experience, front desk or visitor services, but now it's thought of more as an experience, as a continuum. And you even see some museums going into user experience and taking that a little deeper and further, thinking of the holisticness of it all. I want to point out a few spaces. The First Americans Museum in Oklahoma is a museum that honors the Native American Indigenous experience, and it is by, for, and planned by Native Americans in that region of the country. It is built in a circle, and this circle in the center of the circular building has flags from the different Native nations that are represented, and really centering the first voice of Native Americans and American Indians. Sorry, there's sirens behind me. Also, again, highlighting Smithsonian, the Contemplation Court at the National Museum of African American History and Culture is a very powerful space. In the midst of all the story you're seeing about the African American experience in the Americas, there is this space where there is water falling, there are quotes on the wall, kind of smooth stone seating and flooring. It's a very minimalist environment meant to help you process some of what you're seeing. If you are overwhelmed or overcome, you can go there, gather your thoughts. And many people do come to that space. And it is one of the favorite spaces that I go to when I'm at the Smithsonian, but it's a best in class example of a contemplation court or a contemplation space. Keeping it moving programs, socially responsive practice, right? How can there be publicly available, accessible special events, festivals, series, talks, salons, performances that are reflective of current events and beyond? Just highlighting a little bit of my work that I did in Brooklyn, New York at Weeksville Heritage Center. I curated an exhibition, both public history and contemporary art, called In Pursuit of Freedom Now. And this is another example where, in addition to, having a lot of people there, I wanted the artists to speak about their work. So the artist here, Kimetta Pearl, is explaining the image that you see, which is called Self-Defense, which is of a woman holding a knife in a defensive posture. To my right, I'm wearing the blue dress. To my right are three young ladies who were our community co-curators. So there were people in the local community that were interested in learning the work of museums, didn't go to school for it, but still wanted to get involved. And I had them apprentice under me and work with the museum and learn what we did and be very much in charge and point for the public programs and all the things we planned. And we had, fashion shows and yoga days and all the sorts of things that people like to go to. And we did that work in the museum, which was super dynamic and fun, celebrating Weeksville Heritage Center, which is in Brooklyn, which is a series of historic homes that talk about freedom and how African Americans sought freedom there in the midst of enslavement. I also wanted to highlight the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles, California, as a place that does great programs for children. This installation exhibition they have called Noah's Ark is teaching values-based learning through the story of Noah's Ark, which is a biblical story, but has a lot of application to the thoughts that many students are thinking about today, thoughts about neighborliness and sustainability, about animals and caring. and all the things you're seeing. So you're seeing an intergenerational group. It definitely is aimed for early learners, but they do programs every day, from story times, mommy and me play sessions, and the space. I mean, it's set up. It's so grand. It's so big. I mean, in California they have all this space, but it's really set up for people to come and stay and dwell there. You take your kids there and you hang out for the day. And there are educators in song and dance. Many of their educators are also theater artists as well, so they're bringing that theatrical component. Education, right? How can someone have an inquiry-based experience, a tour, a curriculum, a family program, an activity kit that enriches their learning, fosters tolerance, and engages communities intergenerationally, bilingually, and beyond? And in the spirit of time, I'm just going to cycle through the Africa Center in New York. Does great work. This is an installation view of their exterior, where they had a Black Lives Matter mural and some of the names of people who were slain, who were both African, continental African, and African American. Every year, they would put on a program around this, kind of an educational program, saying the names, reminding people of the circumstances, and teaching people about self-defense, and police brutality and how to fight back against it. And they also do a lot of work around being a think tank for different diplomats and African nations that are trying to figure out their economic futures. The Queen's Museum had a really interesting exhibit about the 28th Amendment, where they were doing some teaching and learning around that, and giving people to give their feedback, collecting oral histories. Oh, I'm cycling through because I thought that was not the last slide. That was the last slide. So in closing, I will say there are really great examples of socially responsive practice in the world all around us. And I welcome you with any questions you have, or to share your examples of socially responsive museums. And with that, I am done. And I thank you very much. And we're
Thanks.
going to hold on for Q&As.
Thanks so much, Monica. Appreciate you sharing all those examples. It's like a real tour you gave us of what's going on in the field, and you know, some of the different kind of locally specific practices that are you know, sometimes a little hard to get a hold of if you are just looking at their website. So appreciate you you know, giving us some of the kind of texture and context of what's going on in each situation.